Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Schools are back in session and classrooms have fewer resources this year. So how are budget cuts impacting your school, and will the new federal money make a difference? We'll update the situation and take your questions. Stay tuned. Dialogue is next. Hello, I'm Joan Cartan Hansen. Thank you for joining us here on Idaho Public Television, on the World Wide Web, and on public radio stations. On the first day of school in the Meridian District, the district phones were overloaded with parents complaining about lost bus routes. The Madison County School District lost some of its experienced upper division math and science teachers over the summer because those teachers could find higher paying jobs in Wyoming or other nearby institutions. In Potlatch, the first day of school went smoothly, but because the district had cut the first 2 prep days of the school year, teachers had to prepare for classes on their own over the summer. When Governor Otter and the Idaho legislature slashed the public school appropriation by more than $128 million last session, school district officials said they would have to make dramatic cuts. What was talk last spring became reality when kids went back to school. But there may be some relief. Thanks to a new federal education jobs fund, Idaho will be receiving $51.6 million in one-time monies. But is it enough? Is it too late for this school year? And in the long run, how will this budget crisis impact Idaho school children? Earlier this year, we brought together 4 educators and administrators from around the state to talk about Idaho's educational system. We bring them back to find out what's happening in Idaho's classrooms. Joining us in our Pocatello studio is Jeffrey Thomas, Superintendent of the Madison County School District. Sir, thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
In our Moscow station is Mark Moore, Potlatch District School Board member. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Nice to be here, Joan.
And joining me here in Boise is Linda Clark, Superintendent of the Meridian District. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for the invitation.
And Sherry Wood, President of the Idaho Education Association. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And of course, we want you to be a part of the conversation. Give us a call, toll free at 1-800-973-9800. Well, let's kick off the conversation with how did the school year start in your views? Let's start around the state. Let's go to Pocatello first.
Well, the school year started quite well. We had several parent meetings in the spring and meetings with staff, and so we were able to outline the cuts we discussed the cuts that were possible that we're going to have to enact. We cut about $900,000 out of our operating budget before negotiations began. And then as school began, the biggest challenge we had was trying to find upper level division math and science teachers, and it's very difficult. Our border is incredibly close to Wyoming, and we lost a number of highly talented and qualified teachers to Wyoming, and some to Brigham Young University, Idaho. And it's when your budgets are being cut, not only the 7.5% this year, but also the cuts that happened in the previous years, which totaled to about 14% over 2 years, it is incredibly difficult to compete with these other institutions that either have private funding or they have better state resources to draw from. But despite all that, we had a good start, and we're up about 83 students in our district.
And Mark, how about the Potlatch district there?
Well, as Jeff just indicated a moment ago, last spring we dealt with the budgetary issues by making cuts to the operating budget and then dealing with the salaries and benefits through our negotiation process. We were able to strike an agreement, and so before the school year ended, our teachers, our staff knew what they were going to need to do coming back into the school year. Thus, although our teachers lost a couple of prep days, being the professionals that they are, they were able to get their work together. We, as a board of trustees, served up and offered up a barbecue lunch for the first day that they came back in order to show them a little appreciation of how hard they work and what they do for our district. And from what I'm told, we too are up in student population and everything is moving smoothly at the present time.
Meridian?
Well, we had an interesting start.
You had the bus
you,
problem.
you referenced the buses, and of course, we had to cut $1.3 million just from transportation. So that was elimination of 56 bus routes and 1,400 bus stops of the 6,000 stops that we have had. We cut $11.5 million before we began to negotiate, and had patron approval to use $4 million of plant facility money for general funds, but that's still $11.5 million from operations. That means no money for new textbook adoptions, no money for staff development, all those kinds of things that we had outlined to our patrons. But clearly the issue that was on most folks' mind was drastic changes in how students are transported to and from school, major changes in the bus routes, and eliminating the buses going through subdivisions to more of a collector system, and that just took a lot of planning and changing.
And transportation money comes directly from the state.
It comes directly from the state, and we had a $1 million cut, and then we were over last year's ceiling by $300,000. So that those two figures were very significant cuts.
Sure, you had a chance to get some feedback from teachers all over the state. What have you heard?
Actually, as I've traveled around the state, I've heard a lot of interesting stories of not having the ability to have any time to get their class ready unless they did it on their own time. Class size increases to where many teachers might have had 23 second graders last year, and now they have 29 or 30 or 31. So less opportunity for individual time with your teacher or for students. I've heard stories of teachers applying for grants all over the United States in order to have any money for their libraries. The whole idea of parents having to shell out extra money to enroll their children or to pay fees for taking advanced math and science courses. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on of the realities of the cuts over the last 2 years.
We received a number of emails, and I'll throw this out to the group. My favorite one, sadly to say, was the parent who said that she was asked to bring in toilet paper, that the school budget was such that toilet paper was on the list along with Kleenexes and pens and pens. That it was just, this is what the reality of the new situation. So let's talk about the federal education money. Is that going to make a difference?
It is, yes, it is going to help. We felt it was very important to use it for what it was intended, which was to restore days that were lost in the contract, to restore positions that had been cut, and to stave off any further staff cuts. So we, our board approved restoring 5 of the 7 days which were cut. Very importantly, 3 of those days were school days. So we were able to add the 3 days back, as well as 2 professional development days at the end of the year. That will help significantly. We also rehired 2.8 counselors, 1.6 school nurses. And that's important because those were areas that had been cut that classroom teachers and students would feel as the year was progressing. So we also held $1.4 million back for next year, because that's about what we that's about the amount of staff that we put into the federal ARA money that will go away, and we're very concerned about that cliff that's coming.
Well, let's get our first caller in here. Tori in Boise. Tori.
Hi. As a parent and patron, I would like to say and how that money is spent over the next couple of years. And I was wondering if one of the superintendents or the school board member could explain the process of deciding how these funds are spent, and how can myself as a parent get involved in this, because I'm pretty upset.
Okay. Let's put the question out. How is the federal? Okay, go ahead.
I'd be happy to answer that. Tori, if you were here in the Potlatch School District, you certainly would have the ability to communicate with me or any of the other board members as to your desires as to how that money is to be spent. What's happening around the state is that we're taking information from our superintendents, from our budget writers, from our business managers as to their ideas as to the best way to use the funds. We're taking information from the teacher associations as to what they think should be done with the funds, and we're just gathering their information at this point in time. I know that Meridian is the first district to have made a decision, but I don't believe there any other districts in the state have made the decision as to what to do with the funds. And so we're right now just gathering that information, trying to see how our economic cycles are going to continue to flow in order to make prudent decisions down the road. You have to remember we have 27 months in which to spend this money, and if you remember the phrase that Linda used just a moment ago, there is an ARA cliff coming in 2012.
You both mentioned the, I'm sorry, I apologize for interrupting, an ARM cliff. ARA, what is that?
The American Recovery and Reinvestment
Act.
Act.
So this was the first round of federal stimulus dollars.
Was a 2-year infusion of funds that came to school districts through the Special Education and Title I funding. And as a part of that, all the school districts in the country were told that they could move half of the special ed, use half of the special ed money that came on a one-time basis into staff. And so many of us moved that amount there. Well, when that money goes away, if Congress does not increase the allocation for special education, those folks will have to be reabsorbed into the general fund. That is a huge cliff. That money ends this year.
Okay, and I apologize for interrupting you, Mark. I just want to make sure that get that clear.
Well, I want to speak, I'd like to speak to something that Mark said, that true to fact, the law does state that a district has 27 months to spend the money, but I have been on 4 different conference calls with the U.S. Secretary Arne Duncan, and Arne Duncan says over and over and over and over again that the intent of the law, the intent of the money is to use it this year, in this school year, to restore cuts that were taken based on the cuts that happened in the legislature. And when I look at this sheet that I have here of all the school districts and all of the cuts that were taken across the state, when you total it up, and I still have several districts that aren't reported on this report, we have over 208 furlough days in the state. That is over an entire school year cut because of the cuts that we took last year in the legislature. And I see here Potlatch took 8 furlough days, and so I think what Linda said is that, you know, if this money flows to every district as it has, Potlatch ought to be looking at restoring some of those furlough days and getting the kids back in school for the cuts. I think that patrons of the woman that just called in, she has a right to say, I raised my taxes, I passed a levy, now the state gets this money and we're looking at putting it in a savings account. That's wrong. And the legislature needs to live up to their constitutional obligation and the oath they took and fund public schools in a thorough manner.
Let me get to Will.
Hey, Joan.
May I respond?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sure.
Or-
Well, let's go to Jeff and then go to Mark, and then I'll get my phone call. Jeff?
You know, and I think Sherry's correct in the sense that, you know, everyone is sympathetic to everyone, all of our educators that are woefully undercompensated for the incredible work that they do every year. We're very sympathetic to that. And everyone, not just teachers, but everyone in our district took significant salary cuts. The concern is, if, for example, in the Madison School District, and the Board of Trustees looked at that money and we discussed it, and knowing that we had some time, they wanted to just deliberate and wait a few months to see how the economic forces play out. We know where we are financially right now. They knew where they are. So they made a very pragmatic step, in my opinion, to wait and see. And then you can always use that money in January, February, March, whatever, and restore a day here or there. And they want to do that. But the concern is what occurs next year. Even if we restore days this year, then we turn around and have to take additional cuts next year if the legislature doesn't come forward and adequately fund public education. And that just remains to be seen. But I think that boards of trustees are trustees in trust. And they're doing the very best they can, and they're trying to protect their teachers and their staff as well. So there's an element of, well, not trying to be stingy. It's more of a, let's wait and see and protect these people.
Okay. Mark, did you want to add something, or shall I go to the call?
I would only add to that you have to remember that as a trustee, my responsibility is to the child. And that's my primary responsibility. And in looking at my primary responsibility, I look at who I have to bring to the child to help them. I have to not only bring a teacher, but an administrator, staff persons, bus drivers. And I have patrons. I have the whole group of individuals that I represent and that I take input from. And Jeff is absolutely correct in that we're looking at it from a holistic standpoint. It isn't just that the state of Idaho is going to get $51 million. That's $51 million against a shortfall of 128, which leaves a significant sum, about 77, that we still have to cover. Now we're losing additional federal funds that were there for 2 years. And we talk about in terms of, well, what's happening with our statewide revenues? Yes, they may be improving, but are they going to improve enough to cover education? Besides education, don't we also have to cover health and welfare? Don't we have to cover Medicaid? Don't we have to cover transportation? We are competing for dollars around the state with the other entities that need those dollars. Thus, I believe it is very prudent to wait, whether it's a month or 2 or 3 or whatever the time period is, in order to see where you're at, because the cliff is there, we're fast approaching it, and we need to prepare for it.
Oh, I want to get this call in, then I know we've got some comments here. Will in Idaho Falls. Will?
Yeah, I was calling up because with the last legislation, I was actually kind of pleased with the way that the governor and the state superintendent actually encouraged districts to stretch the money over the next 2 years. So what I kind of know is what do the superintendents and school board members plan to spend the funds on in the current year, and how they plan to save some of that money for the next year?
Now, there's some real sideboards on what you can spend the money on. The money that's coming in the new. What can you spend the money for?
That's what I was going to say, Joan. It's Congress was very clear in what the funds could be spent for. They were also equally clear in what they could not be spent for. They could not be spent for a state to backfill, to tuck away for a rainy day. And it was very clear that they must be spent on salaries and benefits for teachers and building level administrators.
So the district office.
District office. We have about 70 people in our office who, at this point, still have the full 7-day cut in their salaries. It also, the language was very clear that while we have 27 months to spend it, as we researched it, our board felt very strongly that it was clear that it was intended to restore those positions that were cut this year and to restore those school days that were cut this year. And that is what we did, of course, with, as I said, a hedge, not spending all of the money. If cuts are coming next year, we really felt it was important for us to do what we could do for our staff now, and then if they have to take additional cuts next year, they're still cut this year. We could not restore it all. But the money was very clearly earmarked for that. So I suppose someone has to be first, but I don't believe we were first in haste, because we researched it also and our board deliberated about our recommendation before they took action.
I want to throw out what I think is a chicken and egg problem. If the districts hold on to the money and say, okay, we know this cliff is going to come next year, we know there's going to be problems next year, and they hold on, doesn't that just give the license to those legislators who do not want to continue funding education at the levels, saying, well, you guys have all this money in the bank, we're not going to fund you, we're going to spend the money on other priorities? Isn't it kind of a chicken and an egg problem? Of course, then I guess the other end of that chicken and egg, you spend all the money, then the big hit cut.
I think that's exactly what's happening, is that, if we save the money now and it's in the hands of the school districts now. The legislature doesn't have any ability to spend this money. It's now out to the school districts, and whatever each district receives, the school board and administration and the teachers are to work together to figure out what's the best way to spend it. But if we bank it all, my guess is the legislature is going to look at the bottom line and say, well, we banked 40,000 of that 51 million, 40 million of the 51 million, and they're just going to take that right off the top and say, well, that's 40 million we don't have to come up with. And so I believe that since the law was passed to use it this year, that we should be using it this year. I mean, the kids this year are just as important as the ones next year and the ones last year.
I want to give Mark or Jeff a chance to hop in. Do you fear that chicken and egg problem?
No, I don't fear it at all. Your question presumed that the legislature, in fact, you used the phrase that the legislature wants to not fund public education. I don't believe there's a single legislator in this state that doesn't want to fund public education. And I believe firmly that they want to fund it to the fullest of their ability. But their ability has been limited as well. Trustees also want to provide for their staff, whether the staff be administrators, teachers, custodians, or bus drivers. They want to provide for them so that we are able to provide a thorough and complete education.
Well,
for
forgive
the
me.
students.
I didn't mean to suggest that there are legislators who don't want to fund public education at proper levels. Most legislators do. There are some legislators, though, who think that the lower levels are more appropriate. So that question of appropriateness is still a question. And by having money in the bank, doesn't that give them more freedom
Well,
to
Joan,
move?
if I could weigh in on this, Joan, just so it would be short-sighted for the legislature to take a look at that money and say, well, they've got 41 million or whatever from the federal government. That's one-time money, and Sherry was exactly correct, where she said that the children today are just as important as the children tomorrow or next year or down the road. And so the legislature's responsibility is for adequate funding and reasonable funding for the ongoing, for the future, to stabilize funding this year, to stabilize funding next year, to look at federal funds and say, well, they've got this and they don't need that. And I agree with Mark. I think the intent of the legislature, they're, for the most part, they're good-hearted people who are trying to do their level best to come up with money the best way they can. But to look at it, that's very short-sighted, and I would be surprised if they just said, well, we'll just cut more because this federal money is one time. The ARA money is
Right.
essentially one time.
Well, let
And
me
so
flip that around on the other side. How do you argue that those people who are in health and welfare, who are developmentally disabled, who are really hit, why should they be hit when education actually has some money? Why don't we spread it around a little bit and give them a break?
By using the
Well,
say you've got
can't-
money in the bank. We can not give you money this year, but this year we really didn't fund services to the poor and disabled as well as we could have. Let's use some of that money there, and because you've got some funding. I mean, that's the kind of the other part of the chicken.
Money
and
in
egg
the bank
syndrome.
is a very interesting concept. The legislature for years has been concerned about fund balances that districts have had. And in fact, most, if not all, well, most of the districts have had to spend the significant amounts of their fund balance even, to even keep operations going. Back to the caller's question, this money does nothing to restore, in our case, $11.5 million that was cut, or the $4 million that was shifted from our plant facility to the general fund, or as Jeffrey said, I think he said 700,000 or 750,000 that were cut from the general fund. So those cuts that were put in place as a result of the legislature's action are still there. This is money in a very narrow definition in terms of what it can be used for. But we all still have those very draconian cuts.
Let me get to Joy in Coeur d'Alene. Joy,
Yes.
go ahead.
As I understand it, it's up to each local district to decide how this federal money is spent.
That's right.
How, as citizens, are we ensured that it's spent effectively? And will the districts be posting data online on how they spend these funds?
The simple answer to that is yes, the district will. There was a bill passed this last year before the legislature that allows and obligates the districts to post their checkbooks essentially on the web. I can't remember what the startup date on that. Maybe Linda, you can, or Jeff, you can help me.
I think it's in effect now.
Yeah, I know the law is in effect now, but I don't think our websites have to be up until maybe November or December. I'm not really sure, but most districts are in the process of doing that now. The other thing, you talk about effectiveness of the dollar. That's a huge, huge question because a dollar is spent wisely in many different forms, whether it be in providing free and reduced lunches or transportation. These dollars have to be spent specifically on salaries and benefits for employees. And so it's added to the group of dollars that your school district has. And it is in the same format as the dollar that you have in your wallet, whether it comes from your wallet or your husband's wallet, whether it comes from a wage or Social Security. It is a resource that you use wisely and prudently, at least that is the presumption. And certainly most districts are working very hard to use those dollars wisely.
It's nice to have the federal money. How complicated is it going to be to implement some of the changes now that the school year's gotten started? And we really only have about 2 minutes left.
Well,
so.
since I just learned tonight that we're the only ones who've made the decision, I guess I'll answer. We added those days back in at the end of the year by adding 3 school days, extending the ending day of school, 3 days longer
So
for
that's just
students,
good.
and then 2 additional days for teachers, so that they can have that time to look at its achievement scores, make plans for next year, and so on. So from that point, it was not difficult. I also wanted to say that every school district in the state holds budget hearings, public hearings, prior to the time that the Board of Trustees adopts the budget. And that is the citizens' opportunity to come and weigh in on what those cuts in this case were, what the expenditures are. And I believe that the expenditure of the federal jobs money is very public. Every paper, every media outlet is covering how each district handles that. So I don't believe it will be hard to get that information.
And in fact, if you're interested to find out how much money your district is receiving or your charter school, you can go to the Dialogue website. If you go to the Dialogue, idahoptv.org/dialogue, or click on Dialogue, you can go to, we have a table set forth that shows the proposed cuts that each district had, and then in the last column is how much federal money they'll be receiving. So you can go to our website and find that information out. It's available there, and I encourage everyone, if you've never been to if you don't know who your school board members are, go introduce yourself. If you're a parent or a property taxpayer, you should know who they are, know who your legislators are, and make sure that you vote. Boise had its school board election on Tuesday, so get out there and vote. And our time has flown by. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Mark there. Thank you in Moscow. Appreciate that. Jeff, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
in Pocatello.
You're welcome.
And ladies, thank you for joining
you.
here. Linda,
Thank you.
Sherry, I
Thank
appreciate you joining us. Again, if you would like to learn more about school budget cuts, you can find lots of information. In addition to that budget table on our website, you can find out more by going to idahoptv.org, clicking on D4K, on Dialogue, get my show right, clicking on Dialogue. It's there for you. We have links and facts and our web-only conversation that we'll get into right after the show. So check out our website. You can also find us on Facebook. You can search for Dialogue on Idaho Public Television and become a fan, or you can look for our shows online on Idaho Public Television or on YouTube. Thanks for tuning in, and join us here next time on Dialogue.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho. To order a copy of this program from Idaho Public Television, call our toll-free number or visit us on the World Wide Web